Welcome to the deep dive. You're probably here because you want get past the noise, get the real insights, fast.
Yeah, without wading through endless articles.
Exactly. And today, well, we're looking at Brazil. There's some really unexpected stuff happening in politics there.
It really feels like things might be shifting. Several seemingly unconnected events are starting to look related.
Right. So we've picked three key things to unpack. First, Michelle Bolsonaro. She seems to be emerging as, well, a real political force, quite suddenly.
It's definitely catching people's attention.
Then there's this whole controversy around regulating social media. Janja's comments really threw fuel on that fire.
A very charged discussion, that one. And finally,
Potential U.S. sanctions against top Brazilian officials. That could have huge implications.
Definitely. So for this, we've pulled from news commentary, some direct quotes from key players, even video from a student protest to get a feel for the reaction on the ground.
Our mission, as always, is to connect these dots for you. Understand what these developments might actually mean.
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's start with Michelle Bolsonaro. It's striking how the conversation around her has changed. Commentators like Daniela Lima on GloboNews are really talking her up.
Yeah, Lima used that phrase, didn't she? Reina de copas.
Queen of Hearts. What's the context there? It sounds quite significant.
Well, Lima tied it specifically to a couple of incidents. First, the jewelry scandal. Remember that?
Vaguely, yes.
While Bolsonaro was abroad, Michelle directly addressed it, put out a statement, said she had nothing to do with it, called other stories lies. Very forceful.
Okay, so she didn't shy away.
Not at all. And the commentary also highlighted her response to Janja, the current First Lady, who had criticized the state of the Alvorada Palace.
Ah, the presidential residence.
Exactly. Michelle fired back pretty quickly, defending her time there. The takeaway seems to be, when she feels personally attacked, she responds. Directly. No messing around.
And this communication style, is it working?
It seems to be. The commentary points to this directness, this decisiveness, as being quite effective. It grabs attention.
So does this translate into actual political potential?
That's what the analysis suggests, yes. Some observers are saying she might actually have significant electoral potential, maybe even more than others in her husband's political circle.
Really? That's a big claim. Why?
It could be a few things. Maybe she's seen as slightly separate from the most controversial parts of the Bolsonaro presidency. Plus, this communication style, it's assertive, but perhaps perceived differently than her husband's. It gives her a distinct image.
The Queen of Hearts image connecting, perhaps.
Possibly. It seems to offer something, well, slightly different.
It's interesting, too. The commentary noted the political left might find her a trickier opponent than Jair Bolsonaro.
Right. That was mentioned.
Is that just because she's a different person, or is there more to it? Less baggage, maybe?
It's likely a strategic calculation, too. The attack lines honed against Jair Bolsonaro, focusing on specific past statements, policies they might just not land the same way with her.
So she presents a different kind of challenge.
Exactly. A different profile, potentially neutralizing some standard criticisms. Whether that holds up in a real campaign, well, that's another question.
Okay, let's pivot then. This next topic has definitely generated a lot of heat. Janja's comments on social media after her China trip.
Oh, yes. That certainly got people talking.
What exactly did she highlight about the Chinese system?
Well, she mentioned some very specific things. The strict rules they have for kids' screen time starting at age 11, apparently, with very limited hours.
Limited hours.
Yeah. And even more striking, she mentioned that minors basically have no social media access at all.
None. Wow. And consequences.
Serious ones. She mentioned potential legal consequences, including even imprisonment for not following these rules.
Imprisonment for kids using social media.
Or presumably for platforms or parents not enforcing it. The details weren't fully fleshed out in the reporting, but the mention of imprisonment definitely raised eyebrows.
I can imagine. And this is where the interpretation gets, well, controversial.
Precisely. Because some commentators immediately saw this as her praising, or at least positively highlighting, a system known for heavy control and, frankly, non-democratic practices.
Especially in the context of Brazil discussing its own internet regulation.
Exactly. It fed into fears about potential overreach and limiting freedom of expression online in Brazil itself.
And wasn't there also mention of a Chinese expert being consulted?
Yes, that detail came up too. That Brazil might be consulting with someone from China on internet regulation. That amplify the concerns significantly.
Right. The idea of potentially importing aspects of that kind of controlled system.
A system built on very different principles regarding information access compared to most democracies.
Which brings us, rather starkly, to the student protest. Some commentary used this as an example of, well, a different kind of democracy.
A very different kind, yes. We saw footage from the University of São Paulo, USP. It involved a student named Guto Pavanato.
What happened?
It looked pretty intense. Other students were shouting him down, tearing up materials he had, yelling at him to leave campus.
What were they shouting?
Things like accusing him of bringing armed people with him, though there's no confirmation of that, and repeatedly calling him a fascist.
So a very aggressive confrontation.
Yes. And the commentary we reviewed framed this incident, this shouting down and expelling someone with opposing views, as an example of leftist democracy in practice.
A deliberate contrast, then.
A very deliberate contrast being drawn between that scene, the suppression of speech in the university, and the concerns about state control over online speech, potentially inspired by the Chinese model John just spoke about. It highlights these really different views on what free expression means.
Okay, let's shift now to the international dimension. This CNN Brazil report about potential U.S. sanctions, that sounds serious.
It does. The report names some very high-profile figures as potential targets.
Who specifically?
Alexandre de Moraes, he's a Supreme Court justice, Paulo Gonet, the prosecutor general, and Fabio Schor, a federal police delegate. Key figures in the justice system.
And the reasons given.
The report cited alleged human rights violations and political persecution, specifically linked to the investigations into the supposed coup plot after the last election.
Wow. Human rights violations and political persecution are strong accusations.
Very strong. And the report added another layer mentioning U.S. Senator Marco Rubio and suggesting the information might have come to the U.S. government via sources linked to Donald Trump.
So U.S. domestic politics potentially playing a role, too.
It adds complexity, certainly.
What was the reaction from the officials named, or the U.S.?
Well, CNN Brazil said they reached out. The U.S. Embassy apparently gave a no comment.
And the Brazilian officials?
Yeah.
Moraes, Gonet, Schor?
According to the report, they didn't respond to the requests for comment.
No response. How's that being interpreted?
Some commentary suggested that silence might indicate concern. Usually, if allegations like these surface, you'd expect a swift denial and clarification. The lack of one, well, it allowed speculation to build.
And connecting this back, it really shows how domestic political fights in Brazil can suddenly have potentially huge international consequences.
Absolutely. You've got this internal tension, these investigations, these power plays, and now the possibility of the U.S. stepping in with sanctions. It changes the game.
It highlights the international scrutiny, doesn't it?
It does. And potential sanctions could really impact Brazil's international relationships, particularly with the U.S. It also touches on fundamental questions about sovereignty versus international norms on human rights.
So, wrapping up this deep dive then, we've seen Michelle Bolsonaro's surprising rise in prominence, this really contentious debate over social media inspired by Janja's remarks.
The stark contrast provided by that student protest.
And now this looming possibility of U.S. sanctions targeting top officials.
It's quite a mix. And what's striking is how these different pieces, they don't feel isolated anymore. They seem to be weaving together into a larger narrative about Brazil's political direction.
It definitely feels like a moment of flux. Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. How do you see these threads connecting? What does Michelle Bolsonaro's potential tell us about political strategy shifts? How does the social media debate reflect broader global tensions between freedom and control online?
And what about those sanctions? What does it mean when one country considers sanctioning high officials of another over domestic judicial matters? Think about what these developments suggest about power, about expression, and maybe even about what national sovereignty means today.
Lots to think about. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.